prepare to take notes. Just, you're going to have to write these definitions down. There's no way around it. But the good thing is that once you do write those definitions down, you can go back and reference them often. And we're going to use all of these words often over the next several years. So these are notes that like will benefit you, you know, for years and years, not just for this week or for this unit. This you already have written down ideally from yesterday. So I just want to refresh our memories. You don't have to write this down. But remember yesterday we talked about how governments hold political power in a given state. And they are in charge of enforcing laws, maintaining currency like the money system, and protecting people, both in general and from external threats. We talked about this idea of legitimacy, the right to rule, as perceived by the people that a government is ruling over, is holding power over, because this is really all about power. Don't ever forget it. So legitimacy speaks to the source of power for a given government. And then ideology is this other big word that we're going to start trying to use more often so that we become comfortable with it, even though it's really complicated. An ideology is the system of beliefs and values about what is best and right for the state. It has to do with morals. It has to do with a life experience, your view of the world, your view of human nature, what you think is right, how society ought to live. We talked about ideology yesterday, I think, just in terms of like racism is a really easy one to identify, right? We all know what racist people look like. And racism is an ideology. It's a flawed, in my view, bad system of values and beliefs, but a system nonetheless. More commonly in politics, we talk about Republicans and Democrats, right? Two political parties. A political party is just groups based on different ideologies. So we're going to talk more about all of this, but that's just to refresh your memory. Yesterday also, we started setting ourselves up to take notes today with two categories, right? Limited government and unlimited government. And you guys used those concepts really fluidly in the Do First, which is awesome. Today we're going to be building on all of these. So if you chose to make a table like this in your notes, find that place in your notes. If you chose to make one note card for limited government and one for unlimited government, be ready to add to those note cards. And if you're doing this online, you can make two separate lists. You can insert table, make a table with like 3 columns, one for the category all the way on the left, and then one for limited government, one for unlimited government. You can also take notes just by color coding, like just have one color for limited, one color for unlimited, and you don't have to draw like the boxes for the table and all that. Okay. So our key points start now. At this point, you should start taking notes. And our first set of key points are all about types of government. How can we think about all of the different systems in the world that exist now and that have ever existed? Naming each one individually with all of their individual differences is not a useful way of thinking about things because it prevents us from seeing patterns. There's too much detail if we think about each state individually. So people tend to think about government in 2 ways, right? The first way is thinking about what type of government it is based on a source of legitimacy. The reason that the government says they have the right to hold power over anybody. So examples of types of government are democracy, right? Legitimacy, the right to rule in democracies comes from the people. The people often influence government by voting in democracies. We have a different type of government would be monarchy. Monarchy, like kings and queens, they claim the right to rule. They say they have legitimate reason to have power over people, usually for a couple reasons. Mostly they were related to the last king, so lineage, bloodline. But also they usually claim some religious authority to rule too. So like not only is it an important bloodline, but according to whatever religion their god has sanctioned that bloodline or said that, you know, these people should be your king. So here I am. You've got dictatorships who claim the right to rule, usually just on the sheer power that they had to take over a country to begin with, on military power. So in each of those examples, we're talking about governments based on the source of their power. Why are they in charge? Another way to think about governments that's also useful and simpler in a lot of ways is to think about them based on the extent of their power. How much power do they have? This is what we are talking about when we say limited and unlimited governments. Limited governments have limited power, and those limits are set by the rights of people in the state. Usually those rights are written down, and by written law, like the ruler of a state is not above the law. Unlimited governments do not have limits on their power, and those lead to like very different sorts of societies, as we will see. So we're going to be looking at both, right? We're going to look governments in terms of where their power comes, the legitimacy, and also how much power they have, the extent of their power. Here is a map, for example, that gives a good overall view of the world in terms of how much power different governments have. Green, the greener it is, the more limited the democracy, right? Rulers really do have to follow the law. The redder it is, the less democratic it is. When it's like one person in charge, we call that autocratic, if you want the fancy word. So the redder it is on this map, the less power, or the less power people have, the more power the government has. This map, on the other hand, looks at the world in terms of where power comes from for different governments. Alejandro, were you talking? There wasn't purple here. Okay, so this map. Alejandro, I'm guessing you mean purple here, like for China. Is that true? Type yes or no in the chat. So I know how to answer. No, okay. Where's purple? Oh, purple over here, colonies. Great question. Alejandro was asking about purple on the scale. And the purple here refers to a place that is owned by a larger empire. We call that a colony, like a place that has recently been taken over by a giant state that takes over lots of nations, right? Colonies are less commonly called that today. They're less common today, and I can't see on this map where they are, but I would guess like maybe American Samoa might be colored that because they don't have voting rights. You could maybe color Puerto Rico a colony if you really wanted it. Like that's a little controversial, which is maybe why it doesn't show up on the map. But that's a great question. Often the distinctions made here often because when a state conquers a different state and rules it, the place that was conquered usually has even less rights than the people who live in the state that was doing the conquering to begin with. So even if like I live in a dictatorship, which has unlimited government and I have very few, if any, rights, if my dictatorship conquers another land, chances are the people in that land are going to have even fewer rights and the government has even more power to act. So that's why it's on the scale. Let me see if I can find a map for you a little bit later, because that's a really interesting question. On this map, we see governments classified by type. So it's not how much power the government has, it's just like, where does that power come from? What kinds of governments are there? So you'll see, for example, that presidential republics are in blue. Those are democratic. That means that, you know, people vote for their government. That means that it's a limited government. You'll see Saudi Arabia in pink. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. This map shows you how rare those are in the world nowadays. So lots of different ways about thinking about government. Let's get through definitions before I have you looking through more data. All right, this is the totality of what I'm going to have you write down today, but we're going to go one half at a time. So we're going to talk about limited governments first, and then we will flip to talk about unlimited governments. When you're learning vocabulary too, especially like lots of different vocabulary words that all have to do with the same thing, like government types, it's important for you guys to get the definitions of the words, but also start thinking about whether you can explain how each word is different from words that are close to it in meaning. Like level 1 is understanding what a democracy is. You have completely mastered the lesson if you can tell me how direct democracy and representative democracy are different from each other. That's hard to do, and we'll work up to it. But if you're up for a challenge, you should try to think about vocabulary that way. Okay, another map. I really like maps. We'll come back to it. All right, so let's start with the limited government column. All right, I've got lots of pictures for you, lots of information, and I tried to put everything on this one chart. So in this chart, you're going to see both how much power governments have and also what kinds of governments fall into this category. So as we had yesterday, limited governments limit the power of the ruler by law and by the individual rights of citizens. Usually those rights are written in something called a constitution, which is why I have that picture of like the eagle going shah over the We the People thing on the side. The style of rule for limited governments tends to be democratic. That means that in almost every, if not every, limited government that exists today, citizens influence the government by voting. So, rule comes by consent of the governed. Consent of the governed is a phrase that you will see a lot in the context of government and politics. It means that the power comes from the people. Right? Like we saw when we were studying populations, demography is the study of populations of people. So democracy is government by the people. There are a couple different kinds or types of governments that are good examples of limited government. So first, just to tackle the legitimacy question, the question of like, who gives you the right to be the boss of me? A great question. Right, legitimacy in limited governments comes from citizens, often citizens who vote, and or by the government remaining within the limits set by law. If, let's take the Queen of England, for example. The Queen of England is very limited in her ability to do things by law. If she started doing things that she can't do, if she started saying, okay, tomorrow, everybody in England is going to start giving me half of their salary as a tax, or I'm going to throw them into jail, right? That's not something that the law says she can do. And she would lose legitimacy pretty quickly in the eyes of her people if she tried to overreach the limits set by law. So law really is like the litmus test for limited governments. If you stay within the law, you are legitimate. If you overstep, people tend to not see you as being legitimate anymore. There are three major kinds of limited government that we are going to talk about a lot this year and next year and generally in life. And we live in one of these kinds. So please write down all three of these definitions. The first, we're starting where we live, right? A republic. We in the United States live in a republic. A republic is a kind of democracy. Like a Chihuahua is a kind of dog, a republic is a kind of democracy. And in this kind of democracy, citizens vote for representatives to make decisions for us. That means that every time there is a decision to a decision to be made in the government, instead of everybody voting every single time on every decision directly, we save ourselves some time and we vote for a representative that we feel like is going to vote in our best interests. And that representative makes decisions for us for a set period of time until we have to like re-elect people, at which point we see if they made good decisions for us or not. We have senators, for example. Those would be our state representatives, and congressmen, more local representatives. Direct democracy is similar, but more direct. Direct democracy involves citizens voting directly on laws. That means when there's a decision to be made, everybody votes. This is a rarer form of democracy because, as you can imagine, it's hard to make decisions in society if we have to wait for everybody to vote every single time we have a choice to make. But it's a majority rule system. And then finally, we have constitutional monarchy, the Queen of England, for example. Constitutional monarchy is a king or queen who's technically in power because of their bloodline, but who has limits on their ability to act that are set out by a law and often by a parliament, like a representative body of citizens or people of a certain class. It works differently at different times of history. So like the common thing with all of these forms of government is that the ruler's rights to do things are limited by law, and usually those laws protect the individual rights of the people who are living under that government. Direct democracy involves people voting directly. Representative democracy, a republic, for example, involves people voting for representatives who then make decisions for them. As you guys have questions, drop them in the chat. All right, let's look at unlimited governments. Unlimited governments are the stuff of history. They are governments in which one person or a small group of people have full power with no limits on their ability to act. The ruler does not have to obey laws. The ruler is not bound by the rights of citizens. And unlimited governments usually come in one of two different styles of rule. These are concepts that are a little tricky to get. Write them down anyway. We're going to use them a lot. And through use and like seeing examples, you will see what they are and what the difference is. But generally, unlike in our last slide, limited governments have a democratic style of rule, right? Like people vote, and that's kind of how it works. Unlimited governments are usually authoritarian, which means the government imposes decisions on citizens without their consent, or totalitarian, which means the government like does the authoritarian thing, but like times a million. It's a government that claims total control over citizens' private and public lives. So authoritarian governments will tell you what to do and what you think doesn't matter. Totalitarian governments will do that, but they'll also police what you think, what you watch on TV, what religion you practice, what you read in the history books. If you say something that isn't permitted, you'll probably get in big trouble with secret police. Totalitarian governments are terrifying. We're going to learn all about them in world history next year. You can use, let's use schools to help us understand this too, right? Like you've probably had teachers with very democratic, limited government styles of teaching where they care what you guys think about what the lessons are like and how you're feeling and if you're interested or not. You've probably also had teachers who are more authoritarian. That means that they try to just tell you what to do. It doesn't matter if you're interested in my lesson, you're going to write this little essay and you're going to tuck in your shirt and, you know. If teachers were totalitarian, and we can't be because you have legal protections, because we live in a limited government. But if teachers were totalitarian, they would not only police what you did and not only make you didn't want to do and not only make you tuck in your shirt and all that stuff, but they'd also go through your phone to see how you're talking about their class. And if you said something that wasn't nice, you'd, I don't know, get ISS forever. I hope that helped. Right, in history, we have seen a bunch of different kinds of governments form around these leadership styles. And the ones I want you to write down for now fall under 3 different kinds. For absolute monarchy, an absolute monarchy is a king or queen with full power in their state. There is no written law that limits their power. There is no concept of the rights of the people that they rule over. That doesn't even exist. It's just the king and his state. The state belongs to him, as do the people. Absolute monarchs claim legitimacy, so the right to rule, based on bloodline, who they're related to. Usually they were king before, right? And based on this religious idea of the divine right of kings, which we'll get to eventually when we start studying history. It just means like, I'm king because God said my family should be king, and you know it because I'm king. It's a cute idea. Theocracies are a second kind of unlimited government, although these are tricky. And we'll get to they're tricky in a minute. For now, just write down that they are governments on religious law. So for theocracies, the right to rule comes from religious law. And that means that the law of the land is religious law. There is no difference. Then finally, dictatorships. We see these a lot in history. A dictatorship is an unlimited government that claims legitimacy, usually based on military power, and usually dictatorships came to power to begin with by using the military to violently overthrow whoever was there beforehand. Usually. Or if not violently, that's how they keep it. So, as you can kind of see from the slides and from this discussion, unlimited governments rely a lot more on force to govern than limited governments, who rely a lot more on consent. All right. I have a couple of warnings for you before I'm like confident letting you guys get to the classwork. My warning number 1 is that states lie all the time about what they are in the titles that they give themselves for names, and that can make it really hard to learn this vocabulary, so I just want to name it. For example, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea is not democratic, it is not a republic, and it certainly does not belong to the people. It is a totalitarian dictatorship. It is the opposite of what it claims to be, which can make it hard to learn these words. Similarly, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, not democratic. And there are a bunch of so-called democracies that technically have presidents, but they rig the elections or you can only vote for one person. So while they're called democracies, they're not really. So sometimes it's really hard to tell. In your classwork, you're going to be looking at this map, the state of democracy, and it shows you like a more accurate picture of what everything really is. Also note that the United States is a flawed democracy now. We can talk about that a little bit later in this class if you guys want, but it is an interesting kind of tragic trajectory to watch. Also, as Caesar notes in the comments, Russia. Russia claims to be a presidential democracy, and yet on this map it shows up as an authoritarian regime because that is what it really is. So, yes. More things to be confused about that I hope to clear up. Right? They're monarchy, kings and queens. They could be limited, they could be unlimited. I'm going to tell you the story about how limited democracies, or sorry, how constitutional monarchies came about, and hopefully that will help you remember why there are 2 kinds. When you were little, you probably saw I hope you saw the Disney's Robin Hood video. If not, if you've ever seen any Robin Hood movie, you know King John. And King John was famous in pop culture, right, for being a terrible, horrible king that, like, you know, took taxes from poor people who were starving and blah, blah, blah. Turns out that was a real guy, and he really was horrible. And he was so horrible that by the end of his rule, he was forced to sign this super important document in history called the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, that set out the rights of some English people that the king had to follow. From then on, the United Kingdom has had a constitutional monarchy. There are rules, the king can't overpass them. And over time, the kings and queens of England have increasingly lost power. On the other hand, there are absolute monarchs. That is a king or queen with enough power to keep power over his state and own it, like it's a possession. Absolute monarchs make the laws. They are not subject to the laws. They are the law. So those are the two different kinds, which is why you see different monarchies on limited versus unlimited. Theocracies are incredibly complicated. Don't write this down. I'll just like click you to the maps. The reason theocracies, governments based on religion, are complicated is because throughout history, most governments, until recently, claimed some sort of religious basis for their right to rule anyway. So like there might have been a king and maybe the land's laws aren't necessarily exactly religious laws, but that king says that he has the right to be in power because of religion or, you know, God chose him or whatever. So to different degrees, you can say that like lots of different places in the world have been theocracies, kind of. If you can't see this slide, I will post it in the chat. This one is actually the least important of them, so lucky you, Isabella. But yeah, what I was saying was that theocracies are hard to identify because there aren't a ton of governments that have like explicitly the head of religion and the head of state being the same thing, but they've kind of blurred over time. For now, just remember theocracy is a government based on religious principles. That's good enough for now. You can see on the